Hello. Okay, welcome everybody. So this is the plenary session on Brexit. This is very well timed. On June 23rd, Britons are going to vote. They're going to answer the question, should the United Kingdom remain a member of the European Union or leave the European Union? So voters will choose between remain a member of the European Union and leave the European Union. There'll be no yes or no votes. As of, I think, Sunday, the FT, the Financial Times poll of polls put opinion polls on 40% to leave, 45% to stay, and 15% for undecided. So just for my own interest, I was wondering if we could do a poll of the audience. So you'll have three options. You will have remain a member of the European Union, you'll have leave the European Union, and you'll have undecided / I don't want to answer this. Okay, so could I have a show of hands for remain a member of the European Union? Right, nice balanced audience here. Good stuff. And leave the European Union? Very good, a few brave souls. And who is undecided? Okay, very good. And I'm going to do another poll, which is a forecast poll, right? So could you put your hand up if you think that Britons will vote to leave the European Union? Okay, so given the fraction who think that Britain should stay in the Union, that's quite an optimistic audience. Wonderful. Well, so today we have a wonderful panel of speakers for you. We have first up is Richard Baldwin, who is the Professor of International Economics at the Graduate Institute of Geneva and Director of the Centre for Economic Policy Research. He's also the Director of Vox, which is the CEPR's policy forum, and where you can find a whole range of articles about Brexit. We also have Swati Dhingra, who is Assistant Professor at the London School of Economics. She's an applied trade economist and has published lots and lots of papers over the last 2 years on Brexit. We then have John van Reenen, who is Professor of Economics at the LSE. He's the Director of the Centre for Economic Performance. He has a very broad range of research areas: the economics of innovation, productivity, industrial organisation, labour economics, public policy and competition policy. He's worked for Number 10, and he's been working a lot on this recent issue of Brexit. And then finally, we have Enrico Spolaore, who is a Professor of Economics at Tufts and a research associate at the NBER. His main research interests are political economy, so we're going to be getting that angle of the debate from him. Wonderful. Okay, so first, can I introduce Richard Baldwin? So, sorry, I should say that the setup is the four speakers will talk for between 5 and 10 minutes. We'll then have a panel discussion, and then we'll open it up for some challenging audience questions.
Oh, thank you. So what I'm going to do is take you through a scenario where this election will end up leaving Britain with less control over its economic policy than it has now. And let me summarize this quickly, in case you fall asleep during the rest of it. British industry and services needs to have single market access in order to perform as it has. If Britain votes no, there will be an outward flow of foreign direct investment and a reduction of inflow of foreign direct investment, exactly as it happened in the late 1980s, when the EFTA countries were being excluded from the single market because they were not members. As that proceeds, governments will realize, British government will realize, backed by its industry and its service sector, that they must get single market access. Exactly as it happened in the EFTA countries in the late 80s, which led to the European Economic Area Agreement. During that negotiations, we discovered that it was impossible to get single market access without some degree of political integration. And by the end of the negotiations, these were countries who, like Britain, wanted to stay out of the sovereignty but get into the single market. They all applied for membership by the end of the talks, because Not being a member meant you would have to obey, but you would not have a say. So if Britain says no, in the process of trying to negotiate single market access, maintaining sovereignty, you'll realize that you need to be in the single market, and now the only way to do that is to follow the rules, the single market. That's why they call it the single market, with free mobility of labor, with the contribution, just like everybody else does it. So in the end, after a lot of uncertainty and economic damage, you'll end up with less sovereignty over your economic policy than you did before. That's my argument. But let me give you a little bit of background. I don't know if I can advance the slides, if we can get the next one. Clicker there, okay, excellent. Helpful audience. Now, what I want to do is explain a little bit why I think so many people misunderstand this essential aspect of the single market, because they're thinking about 20th century trade, not 21st century trade. So give me a couple slides to explain this very quickly, the difference between them. First of all, 20th century trade is what you studied in economics. It's trade theory. Stuff is made here and sold there. Economically, all the barriers are at the border. Politically, the trade is about selling stuff. So that's what this is. 20th century trade, goods crossing borders. Made here, sold there. And the 80-year-old guys who are saying, no worries, you can negotiate access to the single market with lowering your tariffs, this is what they have in mind. That is 20th century trade, and it's still with us. When Britain exports Stilton cheese, this is the kind of model you should have in your mind. But if you talk about aircraft, cars, advanced export-oriented service sectors, it's like this. It's factories crossing borders. Here, north-south, that's from you can ignore that, it's from a different slide, a different talk. But it's the basic idea. 21st century trade is factories crossing borders, and nowadays the trading system is being used to make stuff, not just sell it. Now, once you have factories crossing borders, things that moved inside factories in rich countries are now part of international commerce. And those require a different type of discipline. In particular, there's two types of disciplines that this production sharing or networking requires. The first is supply chain assurances. You need to be sure that goods, services, investment, capital, people can move rapidly among the production facilities with absolute assurance, because you have to keep the whole thing going together. Secondly, you need to be doing business abroad, so you need assurances for your tangible and intangible assets that are in somebody else's jurisdiction. And that's what basically the single market was set up to underpin this kind of trade. If you remember, when they started it in '86, they already had no tariffs, no border measures. So in terms of 21st century trade, it was already free trade. What the free movement of goods, services, people, all that stuff was about was underpinning 21st century trade. So it is this that you need now to participate in these international production networks. And they're very complicated things, so you need a single rule book. And it is when you step out of the European Union, the uncertainty of what you will end up with will discourage investment, at least for a number of years. And as I said, as it happened in EFTA, the political process from in the country forced the government to agree to follow the single market rules without a say. And all of them wanted to join. It was just the Norwegian and the Swiss people who said no, but the governments wanted to get in. And again, this is an internal thing. It's going to be the British companies asking the British government to do this, because otherwise they'll have trouble participating in it. So I have lots more to say, but I think I'm out of time, so I'll just stop there. Oh, I can keep going. No, I'll stop right there. There you go. So this was my last slide. Complex international production networks require a single rule book, and the EU's single market underpins European production networks. So when people talk about trade access, most of the people have in mind this 20th century trade, and that is not what the single market's about. So you need this single market access to get access to it, and either you're in or you're out. It's not a halfway. I can talk a little bit more why that is and all the attempts that have made to unpick it, but it just doesn't work. So let me give you a small historical example. During the 1980s, when EFTA countries like Sweden and Switzerland, who did not want to join the European Union, they tried to negotiate single market access, which included, for example, a separate court. So in the first version of the European Economic Area Agreement, there was something called the EEA court, where disputes between EEA members on single market issues would go to that court rather than the European Court of Justice, which was the EU court. And the European Court of Justice rejected that agreement as against European law, because it would have put the EEA court above the European court. So they tried to do the whole thing, manage the sovereignty. They actually negotiated with the EU, but the court rejected it. And so now it's the EU court who is the head of judging these sorts of things. So if you think you're going to be clever to negotiate single market access but maintain sovereignty, you ought to look at all the other attempts that have been made, and they didn't work. For the very simple reason that if they allowed one exception, everything would become an exception. And not just because Britain versus EU, once they started making exceptions for the British, then the Maltese would want one, and the Swedes would want one, and the Finns would want, the whole thing would blow apart once you start making exceptions. That's why they call it the single market and the acquis communautaire. So they really cannot make you a deal that is going to work better. So I'll stop there. I have a lot more stuff to talk about, but I think it's better with questions.
Okay, so it's a real pleasure to be here and to be able to talk about Brexit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a kind of a bit of a joint presentation with Swati. So when David Cameron made his famous Bloomberg speech, I think back in 2013, saying that, you know, if the Conservatives won the next election, they're going to have a referendum on Brexit, we started talking about this. We put together a kind of team of people around the CEP to kind of think about what the economic questions would be around Brexit and how we could kind of think about them. And we've been producing various pieces of work. We produced a second report on Friday, which was about that, and I'm going to talk about the trade part of that now. So when we think about the economic costs and benefits of Brexit, one way to do this might be an historical approach. So Nick Crafts has a very good overview of the several papers which have looked at what actually happened before and after different countries went in and out of different trade agreements, particularly the EU. You know, Nick summarises this as a kind of a benefit to the UK of around about 10% of GDP. But the obvious criticism of that is that's looking backwards, and you know, if we're thinking looking forwards, maybe you know the EU was good for us then, but we banked all those benefits, and there's not much benefits remaining in now. So, in terms of looking about, you know, thinking about the economics, what the effects are, we wanted to be future-looking and forward-looking. That, you know, obviously that requires some modelling. So, what are the benefits of Brexit? Well, one obvious benefit of Brexit is we save money. There's a net fiscal transfer that we make to the rest of the European Union, and there's a lot of arguments about how big that is. You know, I think the best number here is about 0.3% of GDP. So if you take into account that we get some money for universities and we get money for firms, it comes to about a third of a percentage point of GDP. The other benefits, and we can talk about these more, are about a bonfire or improvements of regulation. We might be able to strike new free trade deals with non-EU countries. But there's costs, and kind of the key cost I'm going to talk about is the fact there might be less trade with the European Union. There's also costs in FDI and migration. We can think of those as a benefit. We can discuss that. I'm just going to focus on the net fiscal cost as the cost, and the kind of benefits as being the benefit as being less money going to Brussels, and the cost as being less trade with the European Union. So in summary, and again, if you fall asleep, basically what we can't find in our current modelling, using a rather narrow kind of standard static trade model, is that there's a net cost of Brexit of something like 1.3 to 2.6% of GDP, or about 850 to 1,700 quid per household in Britain. That's very narrow. If you start including other things like the dynamic effects on productivity, the numbers can get much larger than that, between 6 and 9%. So you know, you have to believe that, you know, if you believe some of these numbers, that there must be other benefits which are beyond this, which we're not taking into account. Another way to say this, and one, I don't know if over the weekend there's been lots of discussion of the work we've been doing. One potential referee kind of put it like this on Twitter. So I mentioned this is my new work on Brexit, and I don't know if Daniel's in the audience, but Daniel said even if this bullshit was true, it's a small price to pay for democracy, sovereignty, and to control our borders. And actually, he's absolutely right. So I think this is a completely legitimate perspective to take. You could believe that there are economic costs of Brexit, but there may be other benefits in terms of sovereignty, of politics, of democracy, or culture, which you think are more important than that. And it is a price you're prepared to pay, and that's a totally legitimate position to have. But I think, as economists, our contribution to the debate should be thinking about, well, what is the price? And if there is a price, as we seem to think, are you prepared to pay the price? These other benefits that you might think are important. Okay, so what do? We have a very standard kind of trade model. It's built on, if you know this model by Costano and Rodriguez-Clare, a kind of gravity model. The nice thing about the Costano and Rodriguez-Clare work is that they actually show that a lot of models, which are often look very complicated in trade with heterogeneous firms and all kinds of things, actually boil down to some rather simple things when you want to think about welfare. So you basically have to think about the flows of goods at the industry level. You want to have multiple sectors, as Richard was saying. There's lots of intermediate trade going on, so you want to take that into account. And you have to think about what the trade elasticity is. So basically, how countries of different, if a country is richer, how much extra imports does it have? So we have estimates of those. And then you have to get some data. So we divide the world into 35 regions or countries, 31 sectors. We have the full bilateral trade matrix, and then we use that to kind of estimate the effects of Brexit. Now, to do that, you then have to say, you have the model to kind of predict what's going to happen, but you also have to think about what might happen, this is the hard thing, after a Brexit took place. What would be the policies, the trade policies between the UK and other countries? So it's kind of three things. One is what happens to tariff barriers. That's the kind of old economics. Of course, tariffs may well go up. Although they could be, if we stay in the EEA, if we join the EEA, they could be similar. But more importantly than tariff barriers are non-tariff barriers. So these are things which are the essence of modern trade agreements. They're about checks at the border, checks over rules of origin, threats of trade acts like anti-dumping, and regulatory differences. And those things actually are much more important and are likely to create some trade costs even in the absence of formal tariff barriers. And then the third thing that we have to think about is that we should have a forward-looking view of this. So over time, what's happened is the internal market in Europe has got closer and closer. That's reduced trade costs and increased trade. And that process is likely to continue over the next 10 or 20 years, as it has done over the past 40 years or so. And if Britain is outside that, we'll gain less from that reduction of non-tariff barriers, say particularly in the service sector, than we would have done had we remained in the single market. So, these are difficult things to calculate. The way we've done this is a kind of optimistic versus a pessimistic case. So these are both kind of realistic outcomes which might happen under the optimistic case where we kind of do a Norway. So Norway's in the European Economic Area. It has access to the single market in goods and services. As Richard said, of course, there are disadvantages to that. We won't have a say in the regulations which are set. It would also be the case that we have to accept free movement of labour, which is one of the things that people who want to leave the European Union are very much against. So if we think those are going to be important, then we won't be able to get that same level of integration as we would have done in the European Economic Area. And we may be more like a standard WTO member and have to pay some standard tariffs. The second thing is kind of tariff barriers. So we measure these non-tariff barriers. We measure these in different ways. In optimistic cases, they only increase by a small amount, by about 2%. In pessimistic cases, they increase by about 6%. You can calibrate these in different ways. These seem to be reasonable guesses. Say, if you look at Norway versus the rest of the EU, what the kind of non-tariff barriers are. And then thirdly, we have to take a view of how we think integration is going to happen. So an optimistic view is that integration slows down very dramatically, so we don't lose out so much not being in the party. A more pessimistic view is integration continues, and in that case, we actually are outside that kind of benefit, and that's another cost to us. So if you put all those together, we find that even on an optimistic view, the overall welfare effects or loss of GDP from leaving the European Union is something like 1.4% or 1.37%. You have a fiscal benefit. The fiscal benefit is not as big as the 0.3%. So Norway, for example, has to pay about 83% on a per head basis of what the UK pays in order to stay in the European Economic Area. So you're not going to save all of that. So that leaves a total net loss of something like 1.3%, about 850 quid per household. A pessimistic case is that you lose about 2.6%, and that's about 1,700 quid. So that's the kind of numbers and the static effects. We can do this across countries as well, actually, so we don't need to just limit ourselves to the UK. An interesting thing, if you look at the trade effects in other countries, other European Union countries also lose out. So our closest trading partners like Ireland, that's the second bar here, also take significant losses to their income. Other countries actually gain because there's trade diversion, so therefore they actually gain. So countries like Russia, Turkey and Taiwan are actual gainers. Maybe that's why Vladimir Putin is a very big supporter of Brexit, because at least economically Russia will be better off. I think there's lots of reasons to think even our pessimistic case is actually too optimistic. So because this is a standard trade model, it's based around comparative advantage. So it leaves out a lot of the dynamic effects which are due to tougher competition, selection, scale and varieties, innovation, competition, and so on. These will all tend to increase productivities, which could be other benefits. So these are much harder to model, but we're doing some of this. A kind of back of the envelope way is to do a kind of reduced form approach by looking at what's actually happened in the past when countries joined the EU. So if you compare joining the EU to being, say, a member of EEA or EFTA, it's about a 25% increase of trade, according to estimates of Bayer et al. And if you put that together with effects of the trade effects on income from people who've used natural experiments like fire, then that implies a much bigger fall of GDP, between about 6.3 and 9.5%. That's like think of this as a kind of one-off fall. So it's not every year. It's a kind of overall welfare, present value of the welfare impact. So that's much larger. And obviously, if you think of numbers like that, it becomes a lot more concerned. Interestingly, those are very similar to the estimates Nick Crafts has made of what the benefits have accrued to the UK of being in the European Union. So, just to summarise, I've given you a kind of what comes out of a very standard kind of structural gravity model, real income losses of, say, 1.3 to 2.6%, much larger dynamic effects. That is only on the economic side. There may be other benefits. That this may be a small price to pay for freedom, some people might view, or you might think this is an unnecessary shock to the UK and the world economy. That's the question, I think, that we're facing on the 23rd of June. Thank you.
My mic on? Okay, so up till now what John has talked about is mainly about trade, which we can measure very well. We know those models very well. So it's very easy to give that kind of number through a trade model. What I'm going to try and do is fill in some of the gaps, that where is that bigger number of 6 to 9.5% coming from? I'm going to try and fill in some of those gaps by talking about a little bit about migration, about investment, and also about regulations and policy. So when David Cameron made his speech about the single market is about the freedom of movement of goods, services, which is what John covered, but it's also about freedom of movement of capital, labor, as well as future policy that's going to be impacted. So I'm going to try and touch upon these issues, mainly drawing on most of the work that colleagues at the CEP have done. So we'll start with immigration. Broadly, what does trade theory say about immigration? How would that impact the UK economy? The immigration coming in from the EU would have very similar effects to trade in goods or trade in services coming in from the EU. So the effect, according to trade theory, should be similar. And when people have tried to model that in a fully structural way, what they tend to find is that if you send all the immigrants back to the EU, back to the home countries where they come from, that would be about a 1.5% drop in GDP for the UK economy. Where's that number coming from? That's coming from essentially less efficient allocation of workers across space. There's a second number which Gabriel Felbermayr and co-authors have put out, which is coming from the Open Europe report, which talks about that a 50% reduction in EU immigration could essentially lead to a drop of about 2.7% in British per capita income. So this number is coming from a purely different approach, but roughly in the same ballpark. We're talking about 1.5 to 2.5%. So that's coming from a structural estimation. The second number is coming from a reduced form estimation. Why are these numbers also positive? Potentially because people like Kristen Dussmann have talked about how immigrants also contribute to the fiscal deficit, contribute to reducing the fiscal deficit. So the number out there for the EEA is roughly about 15 billion pounds. The immigrants coming in from the accession countries is about 5 billion pounds. And this is taking into account all the public services that they use as well. And the reason these numbers are positive is somewhat unsurprising because these are younger, more educated workers who come into the country. So they're not such a big drag on the public services system. But of course, the big question here is what effect is this having on jobs and wages for UK workers? That's sort of the big question which is in the media, which is in the public debate. So I'm going to talk about John Wadsworth's work from the CEP, and I'm going to argue that there's very little effect on British workers. If anything, it's slightly positive. So here's the picture that John Wadsworth has come up with, which is he's looking at changes in county immigrant shares across different British counties. That's the x-axis. And the y-axis is telling you what's going to happen to UK-born unemployment rates for this county. So if you look at the left panel, that's essentially showing you that there's almost a zero correlation. I mean, this is as close to a zero correlation as one can see. The second panel is showing you that it's, even if you look at less skilled individuals, because if we think that the workers coming from Poland are potentially taking away jobs from less educated British workers, we still don't see any kind of correlation. And remember, look at the time period. This is during 2004 to 2012, which is precisely when, covering the time when accession countries came in, a lot of workers came in from the accession countries. And it also picks up the financial crisis time, which we know is the time period when demand for workers in general is lower. So if we don't see big negative effects here, my argument would be that it's unlikely to see big negative numbers come up in the future. You can do a similar kind of exercise, but looking at real wages. Maybe they're not taking away jobs, but they are reducing real wages in these different counties. And you see, again, a fairly similar zero correlation. And even if you update these pictures for more recent time periods, you see a similar zero correlation. Whether it is looking at unemployment, wages, immigration shares don't seem to be the story here. So moving away from migration, what else is potentially going in that 6 to 9.5% number? It's potentially something like investment, which Richard also talked about. So when we look at investment numbers, we're going to have to build sort of on what the EU is saying. The EU allows firms to invest in EU member countries, and it also allows you to sort of draw capital from those countries. So we know from John's work, previous work, that UK multinationals, when they are taken over, they tend to show higher productivity growth. So potentially FDI coming in from abroad, from these more productive countries, is going to have some kind of productivity growth effects. If we take those numbers seriously, so I'm building on work by Bruno Campos and Sol Estrin, which is looking at FDI flows, bilateral FDI flows, and trying to see what happened when countries went towards EU membership. When one of the countries in the bilateral FDI data becomes an EU member, what's the impact on the bilateral FDI flow? And what you tend to see is that the inward flow for countries that move to the EU goes down by about 20. If one of you joins the EU, the number goes up by 20%. So we're taking that number and saying, let's not think about what happens to FDI that's already come, the stock that exists. Potentially it's irreversible. So let's think instead about, in the future, what's going to happen to FDI. And if Britain were to exit, we're going to use this 20% number and say that potentially British FDI is going to go down by 20%, the inflows coming into the country. And this is true even when you put in EFTA dummies in there, you still see that the EU effect is strong. And we're going to take numbers from cross-country growth regressions, which of course, there are always concerns about endogeneity in these numbers. So I'm also going to show you a case study later. But if we put these numbers together from Laura Alfaro's work, what we tend to find is that this would be about a 453% drop, £453 drop in household income every year. So can we get more confidence in these numbers? Because these are, of course, based on highly aggregate data. They, of course, come from cross-country growth regressions. So it might be stretching. We want to check if these numbers make sense, if we have kind of nicer data and do more rigorous modeling. So this is work by Keith Head and Thierry Mayer, which is looking at exactly what Richard explained. This is the 21st century trade. This is when firms can relocate to other countries. So they're looking particularly at the car industry, and they're going to look at 3 different kinds of scenario. So the first scenario is saying, well, nothing much is going to happen in terms of trade barriers. All that's going to happen is, since you're far away from your headquarter, those headquarter destination costs potentially after Brexit might go up. The second optimistic scenario is that not only the headquarter destination costs, but also some of the headquarter location costs will go up. So think of these as being, you're getting some feedback from your headquarter, and that becomes more expensive to do after Brexit. And the final one is kind of the pessimistic scenario, which is saying not only does that happen, but potentially trade barriers in general increase as well on final goods as well as inputs coming into the country. So if we look at those numbers, what we tend to find is that the first effect is not that big, but this third effect is when trade barriers have risen and you see a 12% reduction in UK car production, which regionally is potentially very important in these cities where there is car manufacturing. Not only that, you see that the car price index, so if you look at what the consumption basket in terms of transport equipment is, you see that there would be about a 5% increase in the consumer price index for cars. So I'm going to end with a couple of thoughts about policy and regulation. How much time do I have? Okay. That's fine, don't worry. Okay. So typically what is said is that we want to get national sovereignty. We also want to cut the red tape and the regulations that are imposed by the EU on the UK. What are the numbers that Open Europe has put out? They say that it's about a 0.9% drop in GDP because once you take into account all the regulations that exist that British businesses have to comply with. That number, first of all, comes from not sort of saying what's the counterfactual, which regulations are going to replace these existing regulations. And even putting that aside, those numbers essentially find a somewhat positive net benefit, though there is, of course, a cost as well. And where does one go from these regulations to the next step, which is if these regulations were to go away, what is going to replace it in the UK? The UK already is pretty regulation-free in terms of both the product market as well as the labor market. So it's unlikely that that's going to have big benefits, that if you leave the EU, it's not as though immediately UK is going to become regulation-free, and it potentially shouldn't because it's already doing pretty well. And this is the 1971 poster, which precisely says that one of the reasons people in Britain wanted to potentially join the EU was to get those nice working time directives in place and have 21 days of vacation. This is probably not what your life is going to look like. So I'll end with some final thoughts on what about future policy? What the EU also does for the UK is not just give these sets of regulations, but it also negotiates on behalf of the UK, both in terms of competition policy as well as trade policy. So if you look at the trade policy numbers, one of the concerns is that if we did leave the EU, we would be able to go and negotiate unilaterally with the US, with China, with India, and these are the high growth countries. Our numbers show that in fact the FTAs that the EU has negotiated on behalf of the UK tend to have higher benefits for consumers in the UK than in the EU, despite all the concerns that the EU is essentially taking away, not getting into FTAs that the UK wants it to. So these are numbers coming from a standard sort of demand estimation type Brodan-Weinstein effect, which is what's happening to the consumer price index. And we see that the numbers for the UK are much bigger than the numbers for the EU in terms of quality increases as well as drops in prices. So I'm going to stop there with just one final thought, which is, of course, there's an inescapable trade-off between what you sign off to the EU and what you continue to get through the EU, which is access to the single market. With Brexit, Britain's going to lose its voice in the EU policy-making process. It's also going to lose its voice at the European Court of Justice. And more importantly, sort of going away from the EU and immediately trying to negotiate an agreement with the US is potentially going to be going to impinge on national sovereignty just as much. So that's not the solution either. Okay.
Thank you very much for inviting me. So I will try to provide the political economy perspective on Brexit and how it relates to European integration. So there is a European dilemma that I think has been around not only for decades, perhaps even for centuries. This idea, there are high economies of scale from institutional integration. If Europe could put its act together and have all sorts of institutional integration, commercial integration, which has been a focus so far, so a common legal system, common immigration policies, which is now a huge problem, common defense and security, which has always been a big issue in Europe, well, there would be huge benefits, potentially. And some of these benefits for Britain have been estimated. Right before. Now, on the other hand, though, there is a cost to be paid, which is the high heterogeneity costs that come when different people with different populations, with different cultures, different identities, different histories, they have different preferences over public goods and policies, and they have to share these preferences. Now, the benefits from integration have received a lot of attention by economists in the Brexit debate. Now, these heterogeneity costs are much harder to analyze and assess from an economic perspective in particular. Very often are left out of the analysis. Now, there is a growing empirical literature on these negative effects of political, cultural, ethnic heterogeneity measured in different ways on outcomes such as the provision of public goods, which is central in this debate, redistribution, civil conflict. Now, at the same time, of course, we also know that there are benefits from heterogeneity, from diversity, from having different tastes, different skills, different ideas. Usually they come especially in exchange of rival goods, such as trade, but also factor mobility and so on. So that's why there is this complex trade-off. Now, here is a map of Europe with different ancestral languages. My colleague and I, Roman Badziel at UCLA, and I have been using now data for different regions of Europe, looking at ancestral languages as a proxy for cultural and historical differences, and they seem to have quite an important role in creating barriers to transmission of sorts of things and social interaction and so on. So we know that in Europe there is complex heterogeneity, and this is being a major issue here. Now, how did Europe react to this heterogeneity? Now, the European project itself is an attempt to sidestep the political constraints imposed by this political heterogeneity. So the strategy, the European strategy, has been to partially integrate in some policy functions in a few areas with the expectation that more integration will follow in other areas, gradually, in a sort of what is called sometimes the chain reaction towards the ever closer union. And of course, the ever closer union is a big issue in the Brexit debate. Now, this gradualist strategy is not here as a first choice. It was here because there was a huge failure in the 1950s. There was an attempt to create a defense political community by the 6 original founders of and the French blocked it, and the French parliament blocked it. And then after that, this was the second best. Let's do it gradually, and let's start with commercial integration. Let's start in areas. Well, coal and steel worked. The defense community didn't. Jean Monnet, and the other fathers of European integration said, look, we have to be politically realistic. We start with areas where probably nobody really understands, such as coal and steel, very technical, economic areas, boring, possibly. And then, from there, we will move. We have to build institutions for these things to work. We do a customs union. We don't do a free trade area. Adenauer very clearly said, I want a customs union with the French, because we will have to have common institutions, to have the common tariffs. We want to cooperate. We want to reduce the war, the chances of war, which was a success. So that's how it started. And then, gradually, we moved towards political integration. So this was the idea. Now, Monnet was very clear about that. George Ball was a very important diplomat, American diplomat who worked with Jean Monnet in the 40s and 50s, said, look, there was a well-conceived method in this apparent madness of carve a limited economic sector of the jurisdiction of national governments in just one assumption of leaving everything out, Monnet recognized that the very irrationality of this scheme might provide a pressure to achieve what he wanted, triggered of a chain reaction. That's why I use chain reaction when I analyze this stuff. The awkward and complexity resulting would in particular for coal and steel, would drive member government to accept the idea of pooling other production as well. Now here is some self-promotion in case you are interested in this kind of stuff. In particular, there is this wonderful, wonderful box that that Richard rules, as a sort of benign, dictator, very effectively. So here is an article on that I wrote for Vox, Monnet's chain reaction to the future of Europe, and there is a longer thing in the Journal of Economic Perspectives on what is European integration really about. Now, there are limitations. So here, what am I going to now emphasize is the limitations of this Monnet chain reaction method. I'm a critic of the chain reaction method, the ever closer union, personally. I love the European project per se. I think it was successful. It was very important. But at the same time, this idea of the chain reaction and that every time that you can fix, there is a problem you can fix with further integration is, I think, deeply flawed. Eventually, it would lead to trouble, and it has led to trouble. So you start picking the lower hanging fruits where there are relatively low heterogeneity costs and very high economies of scale, commercial integration, single market, and so on. It works beautifully for a while, but then the heterogeneity costs continue to increase along economic costs because you start, and then you said, oh, but now we have to, now let's do the euro. The euro, well, there are economies of scale, but the heterogeneity cost is way higher. And then, oh, but we need the banking union. Then we need the fiscal union. Then we need the political union. Then we are, if one was to do gradually in this way, it is becoming more and more costly. Of course, that doesn't mean that a subset of less heterogeneous countries couldn't do it, but then they would have to do it more explicitly, not in this functionalist way, but explicitly say, let's set up a political union, let's set up a fiscal union, but not in this gradualist way, let's do it halfway, and then we leave things open and so on. And eventually, if this gradualist strategy become, prohibitively costly, with inefficiency, crisis. And one other thing that I should emphasize, economic integration does not bring political integration. In fact, I've done work with Alberto Alesina and also with Roman Baxel on this. Economic integration could be documented both theoretically and empirically. It tends to bring very often political disintegration. So the functionalist dream, we do economic integration, then we have political integration, is misguided. Now, there is empirical evidence that the partial steps toward European integration are not generating more support for further steps. If you ask Europeans, this is trust towards the European Union. You see it's not a very encouraging graph because every time, and this is a nice paper by Guizzo, Sapienza, and Zingales recently, that's called Monnet's error, partly inspired by this kind of analysis. Every time that there is being moved towards further European integration, there's been a drop in trust towards the European Union among the citizens. So this is very worrisome. Now, I believe that the EU should abandon the chain reaction approach, should introduce more flexibility, more reversibility, and not also lock countries in and said, once you have integrated up to this point, you cannot go back. There should be more flexibility. Different countries within the European Union should be allowed to different levels of institutional integration. That would save, I think, the European project by making it more flexible and more reversible. Reform should make economic political self by themselves. Now, the British government asked to get out of the ever-closer obligation. You know that this was part of the letter that the Cameron, the Prime Minister, sent to the President of the European Council, said to end Britain's obligation towards an ever-closer union as set out in the treaty. Now, there has been critics of this request and Cameron from both sides. There has been Cameron's criticism from anti-EU people that say, well, this is insufficient to preserve British sovereignty. There should be Brexit anyway, because even if we promise that we can get out of the ever-closer union, once we are locked in the dynamics to whatever increasing centralization is there, the EU will necessarily become a federalist superstate, and therefore, we will not be in our interest to do that. Now, my personal view is that these fears exaggerate the current centralist dynamics within the EU. I don't think that given the high political and cultural heterogeneity in Europe, exactly for this political economy analysis, that there is this heterogeneity, it's very unlikely that the chain reaction will continue towards the formation of superstate. But because it's a big question, it's one of the uncertainty about what is going to, but this is my view, this is an exaggeration. Then there are the pro-EU critics that say, oh, Cameron's opting out of the ever-closer union of people commitment is either irrelevant because it was just an aspirational goal without direct legal implication, or it's misguided because the special status for the UK could unravel the EU. Now, in my view, the many pro-EU interests tend to overlook the cost and limits of these dynamics towards the ever-closer union, and I personally think that the special status for Britain might even be a positive precedent. Maybe you can, make a lemonade out of the lemons here and say, look, this creates a precedent for more institutional flexibility and reversibility. So in fact, here I would like to be, provocative and sort of in a different way, not as maybe not the way that usually economists have supported the remaining position, but say maybe the Britain's current situation, which is de facto partial membership, might even be optimal. Because the British have a foot inside in the lower heterogeneity areas, economic integration, and they have the foot outside. Out of the high heterogeneity areas, Euro and Schengen, which have this very high heterogeneity cost, that, as we all know. So now the big question, which I will have open for discussion, is this partial membership status for Britain credible and stable in the long run, if there is no Brexit? And this, I think, is part of the debate. I can give you my own answer, but that's really the question for debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, I wonder if it might work to start off the discussion with Richard, your answer to that last question. Do you have a response to that?
Right away, so.
Wonderful.
So I think it was an excellent presentation of the sort of, the bicycle theory where integration leads to integration and, Europe is made in crises. I think, though, that whole thing ended with the Maastricht Treaty, where the UK was explicitly given an opt-out. And that ended everybody going the same way, just perhaps at different speeds. The second time it ended is when they let in countries like Sweden and Finland, Austria, who have very different views of sovereignty and felt that they wanted to keep in control. And then the final was when they let in all the Central and Eastern European countries who definitely didn't want to give up their sovereignty because they'd just gotten it back from being inside the Soviet bloc. So I think the idea that we're going to an ever closer union has been dead for decades. And it's very clear now in the Eurozone. Essentially, there's no pressure for people to join the Eurozone, countries who don't want to, and the Eurozone is doing all sorts of things on their own. So it's de facto turned into a club of clubs. And Schengen being one example, but there's many examples. So I think this idea that the monnaie is leading to one and there's some inevitable logic, I just think that's completely wrong. And you do not see, as far as I can see, big pressure on countries like Sweden to join the euro, and neither economic nor political pressure. So that would be my answer, is that it is stable, and it has been stable for about a decade and a half.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so I thought next we could talk about the costs and benefits. And one question I had was whether the distribution of these things matters. So you might think that they're quite unequally distributed, and maybe that's, that might be contributing to the divergence between the views of the people in this room and in Britain.
So let me have a go at that. So I think that with the microphone, can you hear it okay? Do the microphone, okay. I think one way to phrase this, I think it's an important thing in the debate, is to say, well, let's buy some of the arguments that many economists have made, and that there are real economic costs for leaving. But those economic costs are all accruing to people like us, to the people who are relatively wealthy, relatively in the higher up part of the income distribution, the elites, and the poor common person is not getting any benefits. So there's two approaches you can take to that. One approach we've tried to do is, in our model, we can actually look at the different ways that the prices of goods and services have changed, and see who are the winners and losers across the income distribution. And what, preliminary evidence when we've done that is that it looks pretty evenly spread across the income distribution. So it's not as if the winners, the kind of winners of being in the EU are all the kind of relatively wealthy people. It's actually mainly, it's the kind of, mainly the people in the middle of the distribution who are better off being in the EU, and the cost of Brexit would fall on them. However, there is an issue on migration, I think, and the worry is, of course, that with migration, that the groups who are particularly lost out are the kind of low-wage, low-skilled groups. Now, as Swati showed you, if you look at the evidence, it doesn't look like there's very much effect on median wages or average wages or unemployment. Some people, Christian Dussman has found some evidence, Christian might be in the room here, that at the very low end of the distribution, there may be some negative effects for the bottom 5% or something, but even those effects are relatively small. So I think even on the argument over inequality, if you look in the labour market side, that there isn't very strong evidence that there has been negative effects of immigration. And, as Swati said, there's been other benefits in terms of overall effects of GDP and also on the public finances.
Can I add a little bit? So I would just add that it's not just income categories, it's also a generational thing. And I think the few years of uncertainty and low investment that would come as UK tried to adjust to a new relationship would hurt young people much worse than old people. People are trying to get their career started who potentially don't have access. And this was very much a debate in the Scandinavian countries during the accession talks in the mid-1990s, was that joining Europe was something for the young people. It was creating opportunities for the young people, whereas the people who already had their jobs, they knew what their career was, it would not be as much of a disruption. So I think that generational thing is also an important consideration, why I thought that really the 16-year-old should vote, because it's their future, not the future of the 60-year-old people who are only 5 years away from retirement. Those ones, it's done. So
on the generational aspect, I'll just add one more thing. So when people at the CEP have looked at the housing stock, and that's one of the sort of main sources of inequality, intergenerational inequality in this country, there's some concern that if immigrants were to come in, the housing stock, essentially the social housing stock, is going to go to them instead of the people who are UK born. And you don't see that kind of effect in the sense that 2/3 of the drop in housing stock available to UK born people is coming purely from just the general drop in social housing stock. It has very little to do with immigration, and if that's the debate one wants to have about intergenerational inequality, then the debate is about creating that stock, not so much about the immigration issue.
Okay. There seems to be quite a lot of, a fair amount of certainty that this would, among economists at least, that there would be costs to exiting the European Union. What are the most important unknowns in this debate?
Well, the two biggest unknowns in my view are, one, can we take for granted that the rest of the world will remain quite open to trade, that there will not be a wave of protectionism outside? So far, it's a relatively, it's not as costly as it used to be in the past to leave large political unions that have a lot of integration, because you can trade a lot with the rest of the world, and you can get integrated, and there is a lot of trade going on with China and other ways without much institutional integration, in spite of all the things that correctly Richard said. It's not that there's not a political union between China and the United States, and there is a lot of the kind of trade that Richard discussed. Now, the question is, we could have a Trump president, we could have, very protectionist parties in power within continental Europe, and these things could change, and that would change very much the dynamic. The other thing is that we cannot necessarily take for granted that voters and democracy will always work, even within Europe, unfortunately. So that this heterogeneity cost that I discussed about, they tend to block sort of excessive integration, or even efficient integration very often. Very often one can show in political economy model that there is integration which would be efficient, would be even better for the median voter or for the average vote, but that for political economy reasons, majorities block it. And that's a democracy. But I think the democracy should work, and you should let the voters decide. But very often there is a non-democratic streak, also not authoritarian streak sometimes that we cannot, we cannot completely rule out. Now, just very shortly about Richard's point that the ever closer union has been dead for 15 years. I agree that the fact that's what happened in practice. In fact, I think that the functionalist theory is the wrong theory to study the European Union. I'm much more of an intergovernmentalist kind of guy. But it's a bit like Marxism. It was the wrong theory to understand the world, but it was a very important theology for the Soviet Union. So you cannot study the European Union without that. It's still very much alive in Brussels. It's very much alive in many governments. And you can see when you deal with Schengen, for example, it's clearly, they are nation states, very much sovereign, so that they decide about this thing, but they pretend that they have a sort of a supranational arrangement, it's completely unenforceable. And then when the crisis comes, they said, oh, now we have to go further, we have to have a common policies and so on. For the euro, it also has happened. And so it's the ever closer union as an attempt to solve problems as an ideology is there, and it's essential. Now, still, to my own question, I would say I believe that the deal that currently Britain has is stable. That would be my answer. It's stable. For example, the reason that you said and that we discussed before. That's now the de facto situation. That's the political economy. But still, that's the uncertainty that we are. That's one of the big uncertainty. The fact that it's stable now doesn't mean that it couldn't be subverted, because we cannot take for granted free trade. We cannot take for granted low conflict. We cannot take for granted even democracy. So these are the big uncertainties.
Just quickly, I think one of the big uncertainties is uncertainty. So in a lot of what we've done, we've looked at the kind of the long run effect. I think that's the right way to think about it, because we should think about this as a vote for the next generation. And so you really want to think about, what's the kind of long run outcomes going to be. But there was a nice, I thought, interesting report that the CBI produced yesterday, and they focus a lot more on the kind of costs in the short run, which is over the period if a Brexit vote takes place, what would be the negotiations which take place over the new free trade deal with Europe, with other countries, that, how big that uncertainty was. We think that if uncertainty increases, this is going to chill a lot of decisions over hiring, over investments, and so on. Those potentially could be very big. We don't know how big they are. We don't know how long the negotiation period is going to take place, how the markets would respond. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty over that short-run uncertainty. I think that's one important thing. I think the other important thing that we don't know about, is what will be the policies post-Brexit. So people who are more positive about Brexit, like Patrick Minford, argue there's going to be very big benefits because we could have much better regulation than we currently do. So we could actually, when we have powers repatriated, we can make a lot more economically liberal types of regulations which would potentially lead to growth, and Swati mentioned this. And that's a possible outcome. Of course, the alternative view is that we may not do those type of changes. In fact, a lot of the costs that are described in the kind of 0.9% that Swati mentioned are things like getting rid of the Working Times Directive, getting rid of the renewable energy strategies. Those are not things I see a lot of enthusiasm for to get rid of. And it's also the case, when we did the LSE Growth Commission, we looked at a lot at the issue of regulation, how regulation could be improved. And the big, in my view, in our view, was the big barriers to improving productivity and regulation are actually homegrown. They're not imported from Brussels. They're things like how we decide on planning and building houses and doing transport and doing energy policy in this country. And those are generally problems that we've created for ourselves. So, I think one has to take a view on how economically liberal and pro-growth policies would be post-Brexit. You could conjure, I think, as we've discussed, quite a negative scenario where things become more inward-looking rather than, we can subsidise industries more because we won't be bound by state aid rules, for example. So, things could go in a rather negative direction rather than a positive direction.
I would just second what John talked about. So a lot of our slides would be irrelevant if we just knew what the plan B was, but we don't have those policies, so it's difficult to say what the precise numbers would be either.
So I think that is one source of uncertainty, is that it's not clear what would actually happen if the vote was to leave, because the leave camp themselves don't agree with what's going to happen. So I've always thought it was rather wise to decide which exit you were going to take before you voted to leave the building. And they haven't decided which way they're going to leave. So there could be an enormous internal political thing first, and then it would take years to negotiate this. And if you look at how other countries have tried to negotiate single market access during this time, it takes them a long time, but they come around to exactly the same solution, which is more or less what Switzerland has now. So maybe UK being a bigger country, you could get a slightly better deal, but not really. And so you come this full thing around, and at the end, the only regulations you could do on your own would be about the shape of cucumbers. And, soft cheeses, whether they're pasteurized and stuff like that in agriculture. And by the way, the numbers about the regulations, most of the regulation in the European Union is from agriculture. There's a huge number numerically. So in the manufacturing, you have to follow those things, not maybe the working directive, but in terms of the regulations for the products, if you don't follow those, if British companies don't follow that, you can't sell to European companies. So it's not even really a question you can then withdraw and then make them all pretend as if it doesn't work. You just cannot cook a different soup in one corner of the pot. And that's what people are saying. We're going to get our sovereignty and then it'll be all set. But the truth is, it's a sovereignty paradox. Unless you can act on your own, cooperation increases your control, not decreases your control. And that's really what's going to end up with, is pretending you can control things on your own, which maybe you could have in the 1950s. You will end up having to cooperate, obey without a say, but it is a paradox. It's a myth that they're actually going to be increasing sovereignty. Unless, of course, you withdraw completely from the single market, and then there will be a big problem with the disruption of industry and the networks. People talk about Canada. Canada is integrated into the North American supply chain and production networks, not the European one. So the Canadian firms don't need what British firms need to continue to stay integrated. So I think I talked a little longer than I thought, but anyways, there we go.
Wonderful. I thought we might open it up for questions now. We have one question from John. What do you want there?
We're all set. Yeah.
I'm a little nervous about saying this, so I've written it down. The referendum on Brexit is not primarily about trade. It isn't about economics in the narrow, even though, quite rightly, economists think that economics is a theory of everything from the brain and then aggregating up. No, the referendum is about the deep question, what is a country and what is the optimal size of a country? Why isn't there one gigantic world country? Or at the other extreme, why aren't we each our own countries, each comprising one individual or family? And it reminds me, of course, of the literature, what is a firm? And the answer hinges on recognizing that contracts are incomplete, and necessarily we're grappling with matters to do with power and control. So, my question to the panel and to ourselves is, what is a country? What is the optimal size? And is the UK at its optimal size? We each have to make up our own minds, those of us who are in Britain. I haven't yet made up my own mind. I very much appreciate what Professor Spolaore had to say to help me make up my mind. I worry about this hackneyed phrase, but nonetheless I think it's very poignant, the democratic deficit. And I suspect that in politics, small is beautiful, and I think that bringing political power closer to the people is a good thing.
I think that's an extremely important question, and this trade-off between all the benefits from integrating and all these costs, this heterogeneity cost, is exactly targeted, analytically to try to answer that question. And if I can do some self-promotion, okay, there's this wonderful book by by Alesina and Spolaore, The Size of Nations, which we wrote several years ago, which has a chapter on everything, of course. And there is a chapter on the European Union, which I read more recently, and I was, hoping that I wouldn't be embarrassed. But we were saying things about, the euro having high heterogeneity costs and so on, and about the democratic deficits also within Europe that I think might be relevant. But about sovereignty, now, Britain is a sovereign country now. It's sovereign, the European Union is not a state. It's not a super state. It's not a federation. Doesn't have a lot of control. It's a bit of a myth even within Brussels itself that they have power. Even the European Court of Justice they rule because the national governments let them rule at the end of the day. Especially because they wanted to commit to themselves, to have a commitment device that so that they would prevent each other originally from imposing tariffs and so on. But the Brussels and the European Commission, they would stop in 2 days if Berlin, London, and London decided that they don't want that anymore. So sovereignty is in the national states. So the European Union is not a super state. Otherwise, it would be way too large, and people should secede from it, in my view, if it was a federal state, because it's way too large and too heterogeneous. Now Britain itself, whether it's an optimal nation, that's the Scots had something to say about that. And when I went to Edinburgh and I spoke to a conference a couple of months before that referendum, I was telling them that, for them, the cost of breaking up, there are some costs of breaking up in terms of change. They were not so high, I think, economically. And then the sovereignty gains could be very substantial because you become a sovereign state for them. Then you move the capital to Edinburgh, you become a sovereign state. So that's a huge benefit. For Britain, it's a very different situation. So it's part of this supranational organization called the European Union, where they have a say. They can contribute. So they have a little weight. They don't have a lot of weight now. I mean, there is a say, but what? It's 10%, 15%. It's not a lot of say, but there's some say. Going out would mean that the weight on those public goods and policies will be a bit less. They will matter less, but it will still be there for the reasons that Richard pointed out. They will still be there. But then there will be a little bit more. It's not, in my view, a big deal in terms of getting a lot of additional sovereignty by leaving the European Union from the point of view of Britain at the moment. The big uncertainty is about the future. It's not about the present. The present, London is the capital of the sovereign states, and it is about the future. And in that sense, I think the theory about optimal political union, I think, helps. And the big problem in the European Union, this is the last thing I will say, in the European Union, is the democratic deficit. That also, that's how this functionalist process of chain reaction was working. Partly was by not completely hearing the voters when they were heterogeneous. They were asked, "Do you want to do this?" They say, "No." "Okay, what did you say? Can you vote again?" Until finally you got the right answer. So there was a democratic deficit on purpose to have this functionalist movement. I think that was a problem, and it might be a problem in the future. So there should be way more democracy within Europe, and I think that's one reason why it's great that there is a referendum. After all, and this is one case of democracy. So we can see a whole country will give legitimacy to Britain staying in the Union if there was a remain, and if there is a leave, it's a great natural experiment that we, as scientists, we would love to see, because finally we can see what happens. We can see whether all this stuff that they so brilliantly show, that we can test. We can test. So I was disappointed that Scotland stayed because it was great for myself. I was saying things that maybe were not true, and so let's see. So as scientists, that would be extremely.
So we've robbed ourselves of a nice natural experiment, essentially. Very good. Okay.
Yeah, 2 questions. We've talked for over an hour now. I'm not sure anybody's mentioned the exchange rate, or we've not at least talked in any depth about the exchange rate. It did occur to me when you looked at the models, what happened in the late 80s. Just if we look at the environment now, it does appear that perhaps we might be more likely in the UK to achieve a real devaluation than was the case in terms of the smaller countries during a higher inflationary environment we were looking at the late 80s. So just a question, to what extent has that exchange rate been modelled and what impact might it have? And secondly, on the migration
the LSE work on migration, it did occur to me, I mean, modelling an environment where basically all non-UK, all the EU nationals, non-UK, are thrown out of the UK, and the UK population remains at a lower population, seems a bit not entirely in line with what we're hearing, if you like, from the Out campaign, who seem to be talking about having a more open immigration policy that isn't biased against the EU. So in that sense, we might see people from around the world replacing those non-UK EU citizens, in which case it seems rather unfair, let me suggest, to say that that such a policy would lead, to quote you, to a less efficient allocation of workers across space. But just perhaps explain why you did that modelling.
So I wasn't claiming that that's about the only effect that migration has, which is a better allocation of workers, which is precisely why the reduced form, the correlations between county immigration shares and the unemployment and wage numbers are important. Because we don't want to take these structural models, which we know build in only one or two channels through which immigration affects the economy. We don't want to take those as just sort of at face value and say we're going to look at nothing else. So which is precisely why John Wadsworth's work is important, I think.
So I think so I think the other thing, the first question, I mean, there's an unknown, right? There's an unknown on what future immigration policy is going to be and how much, immigration might increase from non-EU areas, for example. So I think the second question was how worried should we be when markets open post-Brexit? On the exchange rate, right? Yeah. So if there's a big deal, the markets are worried.
Right. So the exchange rate, obviously, you can't predict with any degree of accuracy. If you want to think about a bigger, sort of in a real model where you could think about how these things work, if the UK gets a significantly worse market access or access to these production networks, that would require a compensating devaluation of the pound to keep everybody employed. That's the way these things usually work. But remember, a devaluation is in terms of trade loss. So, it's, in the short run, you think, oh, devaluation, well, that's wonderful, we'll get a few more jobs. But in the longer run, it's in terms of trade loss. And that really is exactly what goes on. If you have less good access to the rest of the world, the way you adjust to that is essentially lowering your real wages compared to the rest of the world, so you redress the competitiveness so everybody stays employed. But those are extremely long-run things. But then to connect that to, if they vote no, what will happen to the pound, that's not something I'd feel comfortable talking about. And maybe we have other people in the audience who are more capable about exchange rate stuff, but I won't take that up.
Should we worry about the kind of big current account deficit? And
I don't think I've got anything particularly deep to say about this. I mean, I think that the standard thing would be to say that if there's an increase of trade costs and there's a general fall of trade, this is going to overall weaken sterling and therefore end up with one of the mechanisms through which we end up being a bit poorer than we currently are. I think in the short run, because of as we saw the uncertainty and the volatility, we actually saw a big fall of sterling. And, that was an effect as that unwinds or going the other direction. One thing on migration, just to go back to your point there. So, I guess the question is, you could construct a scenario where there is a kind of we put greater controls on EU migration, so we only let in the kind of high-skilled migrants, and we don't let in the low-skilled migrants from the EU, which we can't currently do, and that would be potentially more beneficial than what we have at the moment in terms of the skill mix. I guess I think migration levels are running at something like 320,000 at the moment, and the government has aspiration to bring that down to 100,000. I think about half of the migrants are European, so even if you got rid of half the migration flows, it would still be above the government's cap. So it's not quite obvious, they'd have to kind of reduce the skilled migrants as well as the unskilled migrants to get that level. It's also the case, as Richard said, if we want to be part of the single market, the European Union has always insisted that part of that is free movement of labour. That's what the Swiss have to do. Now, they voted against that, but, whether that, it's likely that they'll have to continue as they are at the moment, as Norway does as other members of the EEA. So that's one of the big issues. Will the European Union kind of roll over, do a good sweetheart deal with the UK, allow blocking of European migrants, allow Britain to have a free access to all the good things and not put any constraints, let us not pay anything into the European budget? It seems really unrealistic to me. I mean, about 10% of European trade goes to the UK, about 50% of our trade goes to the European Union. The incentives on the rest of the EU to give a sweetheart deal to the UK are very poor because they want to encourage the others. And that's all assuming people behave rationally. We'll have delivered, if we leave, a big kick in the economic ghoulies to the rest of the European Union. It's like a divorce. The actual outcomes may be rather, less optimistic than we might hope for. So, those are the kind of considerations I would be kind of worried about in that debate.
Okay, could we take maybe 2 questions at a time? So that gentleman and Paul Johnson.
Fascinating presentations. I just detected a slight distinction between Richard and John's answer to the question, how do you react to the fact it's not about economics, but sort of, in some sense, sentiment and politics? And I think Richard was saying, actually, you don't get extra sovereignty. You want to hammer that home. John was saying, well, you do get some, and this is the price you're paying for it. I'm just wondering what you see is the best response to a Brexiter to that question. How do you make the trade-off? There isn't one, or you say it's going to be very expensive.
Thank you. It's really a question about how we take this conversation out of this room. It was a remarkable show of hands earlier, and Soumaya, you might even want to ask a slightly easier question, which is whether people believe there will be a short and long-run economic cost to leaving, because as John said, you might think that and still vote to leave. So it'd be nice to see whether we have an actually unanimous show of hands on that. But you wouldn't know from the media, the BBC and others, that on this, if nothing else, the economics profession is essentially united in thinking that there will be significant economic costs. So John wrote his, and colleagues did their great paper and blog on this and so on. And you look at the sort of fact-check bit of the BBC website and it says, well, this splendid chap at the LSE did this stuff, and then these people from the Leave campaign said he's in the pockets of Brussels and you don't know whether it's right or wrong. And that's kind of what that's almost as far as the economic debate seems to be going. So I'd like the panelists to reflect on how in this situation we can get to a place where we collectively can have a bit more effect on the debate than I think actually, despite the great efforts of some of the people on the panel, than I think we've actually managed so far.
Hi, so this is about getting to the bottom of the uncertainty of what trade deals arise afterwards. So we've sort of said there'll be uncertainty, but then the buck stops there. We don't really know what will happen. But we know about bargaining. So what bargaining chips would Britain bring to the table if it were to exit in order to negotiate, say, a Norway versus Switzerland? And conversely, if you're in the EU, what benefit is it to you in the EU to have Britain as a Norway-type country or a Swiss-type country? So it's about getting to the bottom of this uncertainty, really.
So I think the framing of the question that John asked it, and it's come up again, is, there is the economics, and then there is this issue of the issue of sovereignty and democracy and so on. I'm actually kind of sympathetic to where Richard is, actually, because I do think that when you look at the types of deals that we are likely to do after we hit Brexit, then it's likely, as we've been discussing, that we'll have to accept a lot of the regulations that Europe has to continue trading them. It means that, in fact, a lot of the things that powers we think we're getting back, are actually not going to get back so much of them. And in many ways, we'll be worse off because, we'll have our nose pressed up at the window, having to accept regulations for which we don't have what did you say, a bail say? No sales. It's a very good expression. So I think I'm sitting there, but on the other hand, I think it may not be correct. I mean, there are some powers which will be brought back, and as John was saying, there will be some elements of democracy we bring back to the UK. So different people take different views on that. So I think that the way I think one of the ways that we can make contributions as economists is to say, well, if you think we'll have less sovereignty outside the European Union, then we'll have less sovereignty if we leave the European Union, and we think there's economic benefit of staying in. It's a win-win. It's like a no-brainer. On the other hand, there's a group of people, and they're probably undecided in the middle, who do think that there is a democratic deficit. We'll get more sovereignty, and for them, I think the question is, are the benefits of that so big? I mean, we have a debate over that. And what's the cost of doing that? I mean, the cost of doing it, this goes to Paul's question, for the economic profession, if we do believe that we see to do the costs are significant, we need to say that very clearly, because whichever side you come on in terms of sovereignty and democracy, there's a price to be paid for that. So, people like my friend Mr. Daniel, when he tweeted me, I mean, it's a legitimate position to say, I'm going to lose $1,000 or $2 of my income, but I think I regain some sovereignty, and that's a legitimate position. But at some point, the cost is so high, you might say, hang on, I'm prepared to give something up. And, people will take different views on that. There's heterogeneity of preferences over that. And as economists, I think our role is actually to say, well, okay, here on the economics is what our best view of what the economic costs could be under different situations. I don't know how we communicate that better. I mean, Paul's the head of the IFS, so he's better at this than any of us in the room. And perhaps, more people in this room coming out and saying that, writing, blogging, talking to people. I mean, talking to ordinary people is actually a very good way of trying to get the message out, not just relying on the media to do that. So I would say that's what we need to be doing more of. Maybe institutionally, the RAS could be doing something more as well. I think that's something we need to think about and discuss. But we do need to be talking about the small. If we just talk about amongst ourselves, forget it. I think we really do need to think about how we communicate that more broadly to the debate happening right now.
Maybe Richard as well.
No, go ahead.
Well, about sovereignty, I think it's important to make a distinction, and it also goes back to John Moore's question about the theory of the firm. It's one thing is to say that a country would impose constraint, would self-constraints itself. Switzerland said, I decide to submit to these regulations in order to have access to the single market, but the Swiss voters could tomorrow decide to do something completely different, or even become protectionist or whatever, with cost that they would impose to themselves, but also maybe with some benefits. It's their choice. So there's the issue about imposing constraints on oneself. And the other, there is fundamental sovereignty, which is the ultimate control after all these constraints have been taken in control. Who is the ultimate control? Now, if Massachusetts, where I live, were to decide that they want to impose barriers to the imports from Rhode Island or from Connecticut, they could get the Supreme Court, the commercial clause. They could get the army. I mean, the federal government could send the marshal, the police, and arrest the governor eventually if he refuses to remove the control. So that's very different in Europe, where that's not the case. The monopoly of coercion, the ultimate monopoly of coercion, the very definition of the state, is in the national governments. So in that sense, sovereignty is already in London. We are talking about self-imposed constraints that we might or might not choose. And now, it's a different thing to say. So I kind of, it's an issue about terminology, but it's also substantial. You're going to say, we already, don't have sovereignty as a European country because of it. That's not the case. I mean, it's not the case because the sovereignty is still there, just that there is a choice that has to be supported by the voters to bind to some constraints, and you could or could not agree to that in the long run. So I think that's the very important issue.
So bargaining chips as well.
Sorry?
Bargaining chips.
Oh, bargaining chips. So, I mean, not much. There is a general argument that they would like to keep trading, and there's many European companies who would lose if the relationship got disrupted. But on the other hand, you have to realize that there is a number of member states who do not want to create a near substitute for membership that's politically acceptable, because that would encourage the succession of, for example, Catalonia or Lombardy. So, and maybe entire nations, but that would be their nation's choice. But there are member states who do not want an alternative to look very good to membership, because that might lead to break up with their own countries. So don't expect the European Union to be very forward-leaning in helping the UK solve its external policy, because they'll be looking inside, not outside. So I don't think they're going to get very much from that at all. Let me say about the how do you sell this thing. I mean, I think the key is to ask people who want to vote to leave, what are you voting for? And of course, the immediate answer is sovereignty. Okay, fine. But let's be a little more specific about that. What are you going to get when you get this sovereignty? So, are you going to get Norway, where the parliamentarians sit by the fax machine, they wait for the directives to come from Brussels, they translate it into Norwegian, and then they pass it into law? Is that what you mean by sovereignty? They call it a fax democracy in Norway, by the way. Or are you talking about Canada, where the UK auto industry, for instance, gets disrupted from the production networks in the rest of Europe? And do you believe that the government could get a political consensus to cause that much disruption to industry and the service sector, and then actually go through? They could start that way and say, we're going to go for this WTO. But when the problems started arising because people feared they wouldn't get it, then they would switch position, and you'll end up with Norway or Switzerland. And as a result, have less control over economic than more. So if you ask them to vote, to be specific about what they're voting for, be clear, look at what is the end point, and would you actually get a political equilibrium or a political consensus in the parliament to do something like Canada or the WTO? If they think about that, they'll realize the answer is no. So then what you'll end up with is Norway or Switzerland, which is not an attractive option, so it won't work. So I think the real weakness in the Leave campaign is they're not specific about what you're going to get if you say leave. And I really think you have to keep stressing that, and the cost of what the different options are very useful for doing that. But if people, practical Brits, eventually say, well, what's that going to look like in the end, that is what's going to cause people to stay safe. So I think that would be my advice for the campaign.
So I just have one concluding thought, which is, there was an article yesterday in the FT which was very rightly titled, "We're going to sleepwalk into Brexit." And unfortunately, that seems to be happening. So if you all get the word out, that would be perfect.
Great. Okay, well, I think it's time for lunch. But just before we go, I think Paul had a request for a vote. So can I just get this right? You want a referendum? The question is, are there short-term costs to leaving, and are there long-term costs to leaving? Okay, and only among the people who would vote to leave? Among everyone? Okay. Are there short and long-term costs to leaving? Show of hands. Yes. Okay. And no? Right, very good. Lunch. Thank you very much. And can I please thank our speakers?